Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. The First Revolution. Bending bamboo. Ascribing infinite value to each individual was the first step in the social engineering revolution ascribed to Moses. A singular, undifferentiated God could sanction lone voices of dissent against the caste differentiation sanctioned by polytheistic gods. Monotheism represents the end of the hierarchy of the gods and the common Egyptian Gentile values they embodied. On the social level, God legitimate the kind of equality to undo the lingering sense of inferiority branded into slaves at the bottom of the Egyptian hierarchy. Remoralization was the condition, and foundation, of national regeneration. On one hand, individual and collective worth in the eyes of God created a basis of order that could affirm itself as qualitatively distinct from the old Egyptian order. On the other hand, this very valuation of individual lives bred new problems of its own. If taken too far in the absence of the force of Egyptian authority, the vastness of their new God-given freedom could spawn a swing from slave technology to the opposite extreme of total self-mastery against all authority. Holy egoisms unbound would lead to total anarchy. When one combines this scenario with the Jewish kinship paradox, the critical stance of the Hebrews so notable in Moses' criticisms of his own people, the potential for anarchy becomes even more obvious. In other words, the infinite value of each life actually exacerbates, not solves, the problem of religious political authority. By magnifying a basis for individual self-esteem, a godly self-image had the potential to magnify egoism and anarchic selfishness. Yet what it actually did was to lay the groundwork for a new, solid, and reliable foundation from which the next step could work from. This foundation was reliable in the sense that there was no ambiguity that one was dealing with a social basis of individual egoisms. The next step arose from questioning the social consequences of this foundational valuation of individual ego souls. What would be alternative to individual selfishness? One of the greatest minds of the Jewish tradition, philosopher and rabbinic scholar Moses Maimonides, offered a solution to the problem of how to effect a permanent change in undesired behavioral traits. His solution is based on avoiding extremes and seeking a shvel hazahav, or golden mean. If one is naturally stingy or argumentative, then the effort to achieve a golden mean will be insufficient, since one will have a natural tendency towards recidivism. In such cases, the 12th century scholar advocated a temporary effort to go to the opposite extreme. A commentary upon Maimonides' teaching illustrates this point. If a bamboo cane is bent in one direction and you wish to straighten it, simply holding the cane straight is of no use, for it will spring back. You have to bend it in the opposite direction, and then it will straighten. For a learned trait, going towards the opposite extreme may achieve the desired balance. However, if the trait is congenital or genetic, then temporary correction will yield only temporary change. To make the behavioral change permanent, the corrective must, for all practical purposes, be construed as eternal. The Jewish religion originated, at least in part, as a permanent corrective to the apparently permanent characteristics of this stiff-necked people. An analogous corrective to a hereditary disposition would be eyeglasses. For a nearsighted person, such as myself, the image that comes through the eye's natural lens comes to its focal point too soon, before it hits the retina. A concave lens corrects this problem by compensating, pushing the focal point in the opposite direction, toward the retina. Through this corrective compensation, the desired golden mean of 20/20th's vision is achieved. Judaism, a civilizational technology that works through an analogous corrective compensation. This means that Judaism is not technological in a peripheral or incidental sense. Judaism is a form of technology in an essential sense. The needs addressed by its socio-technological function are basic to the very impetus of the invention of monotheism. Just as eyeglasses are corrective technology for blurred vision, Judaism is corrective technology for moral political anarchy. Moses's laws and teachings healed a broken people into a divine unity. By dividing the world into its characteristic notions of good and evil, Jews would see the world with moral clarity so that the job of repairing the world, tikkun olam, starting with themselves, could get done. Judaism both maintains and inhibits the consequences of the sanctity of life. Because the holiness of life exacerbates the self-esteem and self-justification of moral critic dissenters, it only served to clarify the nature of the next step of the corrective. Judaism created a solution to problems that it, at least in part, created itself. Judaism's architects solved the problems created by formalizing the value of individuals with rules for social interaction. Love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. This is the major principle of the Torah. While Christians often think of this principle as characteristic of the New Testament, the Palestinian Talmud, Nedarim 9:4, ranked Leviticus 19:18 as the major principle of the Old Testament. Yet in order to understand the importance of the original need for the injunction to love your neighbor as yourself, one must grasp what Jewish sages called sinat hinam, causeless hatred. The fall of the Second Temple, and hence the source of the entire diaspora existence, was traditionally blamed on causeless hatred. This was causeless hatred, not against Gentiles, but among Jews themselves. The selling of Joseph into slavery by his brothers has traditionally regarded as an archetypal expression of this Jewish sin. Dissenting opinions were considered normal, and even desirable, among members of the Sanhedrin, the ancient official Jewish council. Consequently, the Sanhedrin formed a separate governing body that often antagonized the Hasmonean king. The traditional, discordant, bickering and infighting among the tribes and factions of Israel arose at the expense of the strength and unity of the Jewish people as a whole. Causeless hatred can be traced, at least in part, to the Jewish kinship paradox. If the Jewish kinship paradox was socio-biological nature, then Jews needed a miracle supernatural laws that transcended socio-biological nature. The injunction to love your neighbor as yourself was originally designed to correct the Jewish tendency towards causeless hatred among themselves. An expanded Orthodox Jewish translation of the major principle of the Torah clarifies this point: you shall not hate your brother in your heart, you shall reprove your fellow and do not bear a sin because of him. You shall not take revenge and you shall not bear a grudge against the members of your people, you shall love your fellow as yourself, I am Hashem. Regardless of the most immediate cause of any particular case, if this general proclivity itself is innate or causeless, then its cultural remedy must be strong enough to match it. If selfish, discordant, or argumentative qualities create repulsion between people, love creates attraction between people. Like bamboo bent in the opposite direction of its grain to straighten it, the various commandments that realize this principle attempt to bend Jewish behavior in the opposite direction of its grain in order to make Jews morally straight. Original Judaism is more about behavior in this world than belief. Samuel Belkin, a former president of Yeshiva University, corroborated, many attempts have been made to formulate a coherent and systematic approach to Jewish theology. All such attempts, however, have proved unsuccessful, for Judaism was never overly concerned with logical doctrines. It desired rather to evolve a corpus of practices, a code of religious acts, which would establish a mode of religious living. In Judaism, articles of faith and religious theories cannot be divorced from particular practices. The theology of Judaism is contained largely in the halakha in the Jewish judicial system, which concerns itself not with theory but primarily with practice. If Judaism can be said to rest upon the twin principles, the sovereignty of God and the sacredness of the individual, this philosophy is clearly reflected in the halakha. The sovereignty of God and the sacredness of the individual may be the closest thing to general principles in Judaism. Are these two principles a completely arbitrary legacy of a meaningless tradition, or is there something behind their constancy? It is precisely an evolutionary perspective that reveals the relationship between these two poles. Realization of the sacredness of the individual would realize the end of biological selection. The sovereignty of God is identical with the end of biological selection because God, in the form of artificial intelligence, would be identical to the sovereignty of post-biological evolution that brings the rule of biology to an end. Belkin also made the point that the behaviors commanded by Jewish law cannot be reduced to faith or consistent, logical, abstract principles. This view was affirmed even by Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose approach to Judaism stressed the inner spirit, or, agata. Indeed, the surest way to forfeit agata is to abolish halakha, the purest intentions, the finest of devotion, the noblest spiritual aspirations are fatuous when not realized in action. The commandments of Judaism are for this world. In the entire 5 books of Moses there is no clear mention of an afterlife. The afterlife represents a subsequent evolution. The key to changing behavior in Judaism is performing mitzvahs, the divine commandments which define good deeds. The Lord will make you the head, not the tail. You will always be at the top and never at the bottom if only you obey and faithfully observe the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you this day. But if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe faithfully all his commandments and laws which I enjoin upon you this day, all these curses shall come upon you and take effect. Deuteronomy 27:13-15. If the law failed to reveal these divine consequences, it nonetheless had social consequences. It is said that if you don't believe in God, and just do the mitzvahs of Judaism, you will end up believing. Mitzvahs performed had the power to take the raw material of freed Hebrew slaves, without inclination towards the political, and create order out of that chaos. They had the Creator's power to make something out of nothing. The creation of the Jews was possible only by going beyond socio-biological nature. The creation of the Jews began with a decree of supernatural law. Of the major religions, Confucianism might be the closest analog to early Judaism. It is not simply because Confucius's golden rule, do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you, Analects 15:23, is virtually identical to Hillel's. Versions of the same golden rule can be found in nearly all the major religions. Judaism and Confucianism both emphasize ancestral wisdom as a guide for living in this world. They both emphasize behavior more than belief. Westerners tend to notice the relative lack of focus on ultimate justifications in Confucianism, but it is exactly here that one can discern an analogous emphasis on belief in learning and actual behavioral results. Jewish thinking identifies the Yetzer HaTov as the good inclination and the Yetzer HaRa as the evil inclination. The latter is associated with aggressive and lustful instincts, comparable to Freud's ID. Since the predilection of man's heart is evil from his youth, Genesis 8:21, the Jewish prescription is to change undesired inclinations through learning or channel them towards the good. Judaism's focus on behavior managed socially destructive inclinations by channeling them towards socially constructive ends, much like many secular liberal capitalistic philosophies. If channeled properly, Mosaic morality could overlap with forms of individual self-interest. Judaism is a technology based on an informal science of human behavior. Jewish moral laws are meta-socio-biological. They work to counter some aspects of Jewish nature, and strengthen other aspects of Jewish nature, because they work on an understanding about Jewish nature. The last 6 of the 10 Commandments, for example, suggest the basic social problems they sought to negate or correct: familial insubordination, murder, adultery, theft, lying, and greed. The popularity of the 10 Commandments among Christians and Muslims strongly suggests that the social inclinations that defy the commandments are hardly unique to Jews. The normative aim of Mosaic law is not the radically altruistic self-annihilation of universal love, but rather, the golden mean. Without the internal peace and unity that the Mosaic golden mean aspired, Jews would be left fighting against themselves, and hence, left utterly defenseless against their unified enemies. Jewish social ethics of peace could then vilify both anti-social Jews and the anti-social Gentiles who sought to oppress or conquer them. Since Judaism rests, in part, on some generalizations about Jews. Perhaps, in a minority of cases, the commandments might bend certain inordinately altruistic Jews towards a kind of extreme altruism. Is this what happened in the case of Jesus of Nazareth? The logic of the other over the self, taken to its extreme, reveals the emptiness of the ultimate destination of radical altruism on a human level. If every person literally sacrificed themselves for any and everyone else, there would be no one left. From this view, it becomes more clear that altruism, in its original Jewish context, was not meant as an end in itself, but as a limited and selective corrective of Jewish individual egoism. Altruism aimed towards God, but human altruism could reach God only if humans exist in the first place. Jesus radicalized a form of altruism. But here one must be very careful about precisely what kind of altruism Jesus radicalized. At first glance, it would appear that Jesus radicalized love your neighbor. Jesus did praise loving your neighbor, but neighbor can be ambiguous, somewhere between family and enemy. Insofar as loving your neighbor, in practical terms, amounts to loving your kin or your tribe, as opposed to enemies of your kin or tribe, radicalizing the love of kin or tribe would amount to advocating radical Jewish nationalism. Was this Jesus's defining innovation, a morality of exclusive Jewish nationalism? You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matt 5:43-44, Jesus's reversal implied not only loving your enemies, but hating your neighbor insofar, that is, as neighbor is connected with family in opposition to enemy. Jesus did not radicalize the corrective of the Jewish kinship paradox, Jesus radicalized the Jewish kinship paradox itself. This is one reason why Jesus's innovations contradicted Jewish law at its traditional root. Instead of preaching love thy neighbor as a correction of causeless hatred, Jesus radicalized causeless hatred itself. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Matt 10:21-23, in place of the Old Testament commandment, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart," Jesus preached, in effect, "You shall hate your brother in your heart." This necessarily broke Jewish law. And this is why the kind of love Jesus advocated worked against Jewish nationalism and towards human internationalism. This extreme compelled the genesis of Christianity out of Judaism. Unqualified radical altruism leads to the negation of family values. Jewish law tried to promote a limited kin-selective altruism, not radical Jewish nationalism that would contradict the commandment, "You shall love the alien as yourself," Leviticus 19:34. Traditional Judaism strived for a realistic middle ground between exclusivism and inclusivism, and this is why traditional Judaism cannot be reduced to simple principles that radicalize either extreme. What made Judaism a revolution, and a precursor of the distinctly modern revolutions, was break with genetic naturalism through the rational organization of memes, Mosaic law, over genes. The modern idea of revolution is connected with nurturism over naturism because the idea of revolution implies the idea of changing one's fundamental source code, i.e. the fundamental constitutional premises of one's own existence. The core innovation at the heart of the 5 books of Moses is the Exodus paradigm, the inversion of the Egyptian pyramid hierarchy, the first revolution. From Judaism to Christianity to the Neo-Judaism of liberal democracy to Neo-Christianity of Marxism, all of these revolutions share in common the fire started by Moses, the decisive triumph of nurture over socio-biological nature. Like waves that ripple from a singular stone plunged in water, all share reverberations of the first revolution. Like a miracle, the ripples are gathering back to their singularitarian source, humanity's last revolution.